Good afternoon, Ruben and David, and thank you very much for joining me to talk about your book, Wreckonomics, which I found incredibly interesting and stimulating, and I love the way you've written it. So I think it'll be a basis of a great conversation. So I was wondering if we could start, Ruben, with you giving a sort of overview of the core idea of Wreckonomics.
Thank you. Well, we started this book thinking about why are there so many disastrous interventions out there, from war on drugs to the war on terror, to all these crises gathering up on us. And we came up with this idea of Wreckonomics, and essentially it's our name for policies or interventions that fuel and feed off the very problem they say they are combating. And this is a process that has a few very big winners and many big losers, including our very public realm. So we need to start to analyze that and become quite good Wreckonomists ourselves in understanding the different benefits that accrue and gather around failing interventions of different sorts.
Brilliant. Well, maybe we could start just to sort of give an illustration of what you mean, just taking one problem, because obviously you cover a lot, and there's a huge amount in this book about the details, which I thought were fascinating, of these different crises. But I wonder if we actually take just the migration one, just to quickly do that. Ruben, I believe you're the migration as a sort of to illustrate that sort of theory.
Sure, yeah. This is some of my own research over many years now. Has been at the borders of Europe, borders of Western countries that are trying through security means to keep migrants and refugees out of their territories. We've all heard about border fence and wall building happening in the United States, in Southern Europe, patrols, surveillance technology, harsh pushbacks at open sea, and so on and so forth. And of course, lately in the UK, we have the Rwanda policy and similar deals to send people back to the portum, often under very difficult, dangerous circumstances. And what I and many others who've studied this phenomenon have found is that these policies don't really do what they say on the tin. They tend to worsen what happens rather than improve things. We see bigger and bigger crises emerge at the borders, and Calais and the Channel is one case in point, another being the Mediterranean, yet another being the US-Mexico border, where we today see record numbers of people arriving, even after years of billions and billions of dollars in investment in border security. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of this system? Well, on the one hand, border security, fighting migration through security and even military means, has fueled a particular kind of politics. It's brought political gains to many actors on both sides of the border. And secondly, it's brought a whole set of commercial and economic gains as well, to the defense industry, manufacturing the surveillance equipment, to law enforcement agencies who keep seeing ballooning budgets year after year, to the partner forces who fight migration on Europe's or the United States' behalf on the other side of the border. And then, of course, to the smugglers who keep fattening their incomes through each new measure at the border. They see more and more of a captive market of migrants emerging. So this is a system that tends to feed on itself, tend to create further and further crises down the road for the next generation of politicians to deal with, perhaps, or for the next year's political cycle, but that in the process create a whole set of perverse incentives and stupendous gains for a whole set of actors.
I thought it was very interesting, the story in Africa, in the countries where, the game that an African country would play to almost create a crisis of migration and then seek money to address it, but not address it too well, because that would cut off the source of income. So there was this sort of double games, I think you call it, aren't there, of all these players with their own agendas, and also obviously using it as an excuse to cover repression, all sorts of...
Yes. And there are classic cases here, such as Libya under Gaddafi, who various times threatened Europe with big migration crisis and tried to make good on his promise, sending forcibly at gunpoint people across the Mediterranean while he was under attack by NATO allies. We've had similar cases from Morocco in the east in the west to Europe's neighbours further east, who time and again try to calibrate the threat of migration, to bargain with people on the move to obtain some kind of strategic or economic concession.
So David, I mean, you obviously go through a whole range of different types of wars on drugs, wars on terror, etc. And I suppose the deep cynicism of all the actors trying to make something out of other people's suffering. Is this something new, or, I mean, taking an historical view, or in a way, is this just business as usual for large, powerful empires, I guess?
Well, I think we came to the conclusion that some of the manipulation of information around these various failing wars is very sophisticated today in a way that perhaps it wasn't, if you go sufficiently far back in time. But certainly in terms of the willingness and ability of people to kind of game a failing war, if we think about, say, the Vietnam War, I mean, there were a lot of people linked to the South Vietnamese administration who wanted really to orchestrate violence at the appropriate level, as they put it. And I think the prospect of American aid, the prospect of impunity for their attempts to suppress democracy, these were kind of pretty major incentives for keeping war going at a certain level. And the fact that the communist insurgency was not being defeated and was actually being, in a way, strengthened by the tactics that were adopted was not necessarily a problem for many of those people who were gaming the war. So in that sense, it's not in a way new.
So we go back to Vietnam. I wonder if you go back to the Roman Empire and you think of all the ongoing wars on the edge of the Roman Empire with the various barbarians, etc., had all of these same qualities, maybe.
Well, I think, I don't know the case well, but I think as far as Roman politics were concerned, if you could give the impression that you were a war hero, that you were victorious, that you had, the physical wounds to show your courage, that was often a huge asset politically. Whether you were actually as militarily successful as you claimed is another question, and who controls the information environment is something that we do try to sort of give some attention to.
But I suppose the interesting thing at the end, Ruben, is that some of these obviously clearly did end up with failure that no one could hide or pretend was success, like obviously Vietnam and Afghanistan. I mean, I wonder, because I mean, your basic thesis is that you can almost manipulate a situation endlessly, but I wonder what the conditions are where it does all fall to bits. And when that's likely to happen, because that seemingly is that's had a huge impact on Biden, hasn't it? The Afghanistan failure as the person who was last holding the problem.
Yeah, in the book we approach it as a sort of reverse hall of mirrors in a fairground where we turn a grotesque reality into something that looks a lot more beautiful than it actually is. You can massage the metrics of war. We had this in the Vietnam War with the body count, the infamous body count, that in the end, for a while, looked like it was producing the right picture of a war going in the direction the United States wanted it to. But in the end, of course, that mirror will crack, reality will seep through, something will happen, something similar I think we can observe in Afghanistan with the Afghanistan papers that some time ago revealed a massaging of the information environment that was going on for a long time and really covering up what was a disastrous situation on the ground. So in many of these, I guess the more real wars that we discuss in the book, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, the war on terror, sooner or later there will be a reckoning with reality and sort of these kinds of information attempts to game the information environment will get harder and harder. When it comes to some of the other crises we look at, whether in fighting migration or fighting drugs, well, often there's no clear end game of that sort.
Yeah.
So these things can go on for quite a bit longer, and we see that with the war on drugs in particular is really a cautionary tale for us all. In these times when wars seem to be announced right, left and centre, it's been going now in different iterations for over 100 years, one could say. I mean, Nixon launched his version of it in the 70s, but it had been going with the variations for many decades before then. And it seems to always find new ways of reproducing itself, new ways of latching on to further threats and further crises. So,
No, I was just going to say, in the case of the war on terror, I mean, in a way, it was a story of failure from the very beginning, in the sense that, as soon as Saddam Hussein was deposed in Iraq, or in terms of the Iraq invasion, that fed rather directly into the growth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then when they were supposedly defeated, that fed into the growth of ISIS and so on. So these problems, in a way, keep getting reproduced. But then it is possible to put a label on these processes where, we successfully defeated Saddam Hussein, then we successfully defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then we successfully took on ISIS and so on. So it depends how you present it. And I think it's an interesting mix, in terms of Hannah Arendt. She once said that you can kind of retreat into magical thinking, but you can remove your mind from a problem, but you can't remove your body. So there is a certain point at which reality will catch up with you. But then an interesting question is, what do you do when that point arrives? And perhaps you lose in Vietnam, but you could still reinvent the same fantasy in relation to Cambodia or somewhere else. And, are you really facing up to reality at the point where reality sort of knocks you in the teeth? That's an interesting and open question.
Well, I wonder about this idea of facing up to reality, because I suppose all these examples you talk about are politicians trying to create stories or narratives or situations that obviously benefit them politically. And I think your point seems to be people need to face up to reality, actually look at the real causes or so forth. But maybe it's not just the politicians who are not facing up to reality, but they know that the population of the UK, the US, etc., don't want to face up to the realities either. So as a politician, there's nothing in it to actually, the truth is not going to get them anywhere. And that's partly because we're all in denial and want to stay in denial to a lot of the realities of what's happening in the world.
I think that's true up to a point, and I certainly think with something like climate change, a lot of people are in big denial. I also think that people have a pretty firm grasp sometimes of what it is they want and what it is they need. For example, in relation to the health service and healthcare. But we are in a way sold some pretty oversimplistic solutions for some pretty scary problems. And I think we do tend to, in a way, grasp at straws, and we do tend to have faith in people who oversimplify the problem and they oversimplify the solution. And then when that doesn't work out, we have a tendency to sort of latch on to the next promise and to hope, that is going to make a better world. So we are fooling ourselves a little bit in that sense.
And isn't there a sort of element here of, I don't know if it's verging on racism, or at least you always talk about a lot of these things are always losers, but the losers are probably not the elite in the West or the key players, etc. They are other people, potentially othered, who are maybe called drug users, maybe just people we don't know about or feel different from, or they're not us anyway. So in a way, it doesn't matter too much. Do you think there's a racist dimension to this, Ruben?
We highlight in all the wars and interventions we discuss in the book how the costs of them are so staggeringly unequally distributed.
Yeah.
And they tend to hit in ways that perhaps you can expect from just a quick look back at history, at colonial history, Cold War history. Well, most victims of terror attacks after the war on terror was unleashed and fueled a sort of ballooning increase in terror attacks and insurgencies around the world. Well, most of the victims, of course, were in Muslim countries. They were not in Western countries. We can look at the people dying in the Mediterranean, tend to be, of course, African migrants by and large, and so on and so forth. The war on drugs actively, explicitly at some point during the Nixon years, targeting racial minorities in the United States and so on. So this is quite a clear part of the pattern we're seeing here over time. Just to come back and link it back perhaps to the previous question about ordinary voters and ordinary people sort of being quite happy with this state of affairs. I mean, up to a point, obviously, it's convenient to have a simple fix to complex problems, and if someone else, someone who's othered in some way, gets to live with the consequences, then perhaps sadly many voters will live with that arrangement. But take something like migration, where you see actually that these crises at the borders and the situation it generates within Western economies are also not to the benefit of people working within these economies, of citizens, who, as in the United States, get to compete increasingly with people who are unprotected, who can easily be deported, who have no rights, and who unscrupulous employers can exploit more or less as they wish. So this is a race to the bottom that is underway here, that is fed and fueled by these interventions, and that perversely tends to then increase demand for more of these interventions. We just need to try a bit harder, we just need to build that wall a bit harder, and then the problem will go away. But unfortunately it won't. So in the end, the costs also come back and hit citizens and hit more privileged or different groups of people inland, except those initially targeted as well.
I suppose one of the questions here is a matter of ethics, isn't it, David? Because I mean, do we care about these other people? What are the I mean, because you obviously, a lot of these problems, as you paint them, are about people being cynical and self-interested in their own bit, trying to make the best of it for themselves and their immediate sort of groups, I suppose, in all the different parts of the system. And in terms of doing things differently, wouldn't you need some collaboration and common sense of the problem and some sort of way of coming to some reasonable negotiated solution around values?
Yeah, I mean, I think the if you think about, say, the war on terror, you know, I think it was quite deeply infused with the kind of Islamophobia. It doesn't have to be about Islamophobia, and the way that war on terror was, say, taken up in somewhere like Sri Lanka, you know, was prejudice against a completely different set of people. But I think we have to look very carefully at what is the underlying motivation, in a way, in these various wars. And it does raise some very serious ethical problems, as you mentioned. So let's say the intention is to solve the problem of drug addiction and to solve the problem of terrorism and to solve the problem of irregular migration. This is really a very odd way of going about it, because, you know, we try to identify ways in which those problems are all being either stoked or pushed around and taking different forms by the ineffective interventions. So given that, we then, I think, have to ask very serious questions about what was the intention of the people who were launching these apparently benevolent endeavors that were apparently going to benefit everybody. And that does rather direct us towards the economic gains, the political gains, and I think a lot of psychological factors as well in terms of, for example, revenge for 9/11, passing the shame onto other groups, having been shamed, and so on. And this becomes then an ethical minefield. And I think people on the wrong end of these interventions are very conscious of the complexity of motivation behind them. Of course, they don't know exactly what's behind it, but they have some pretty strong ideas. And they are, in a way, not taken in by this presentation that these wars are designed to address these various problems, because the tactics are so often predictably counterproductive. And people are well aware of this.
And that, I suppose, cynicism breeds cynicism, undermining any sense of potential for common purpose or collaboration, and obviously stokes violence. We look at Gaza at the moment, and as the most, I suppose, the scariest example.
Yeah, I think what is the purpose of Israel's military onslaught onto Gaza? We are told that it's to defeat terrorism and to eliminate Hamas. I think most people who know about the region feel that it's going to fuel terrorism. So that is a major logical problem for the Israeli authorities to address.
You don't have to be too sophisticated or thinking to know that this, when you bomb millions of people, then a lot of other people will join, be motivated to join the terrorists, even if you kill a lot of the current ones.
Yes, but I think we're not writing specifically about Gaza in the book, but a lot of people, I think, do see that conclusion, that it's going to be counterproductive, and they draw the conclusion either that the Israeli government is very bad or that it's very stupid. But actually, it's important to go, I think, beyond that and to ask, what are the functions of tactics that are predictably counterproductive? Now, to answer that question in relation to any individual crisis, I think it's very difficult, but it's important to ask.
Well, let's go to a different topic, because obviously our magazine's particularly about economics, and one of the things that jumped out at me in terms of this idea of people having simple fixes that just feed the problem, which then comes back to hit you, but seems to be sort of endlessly reproduced, and everyone in politics seems to agree, is that the answer is economic growth. To such an extent that you get politicians saying that there are three important things: economic growth, and growth. And yet on any sort of common sense basis, we cannot, you cannot go on growing on a finite planet. And I just wonder. I wonder if this is the sort of ultimate simple fix that we've been pursuing for decades, that we can't seem to sort of escape from. Ruben,
I guess we are more Wreckonomists than economists, but we can always try and answer. Yes, I think in many ways, obviously, this is a quick fix if there ever was one, right? And we need to look seriously at that. And at the end of the book, we do open up to wider economic questions. What functions, or how have these interventions emerged and consolidated in the way they have? How can we relate them to wider changes in our economic systems? This sort of chasing of growth on the one hand and financial profiteering on the other, the financial crisis and financial speculation more specifically. And we do try to reflect on that a little bit, but I feel it's almost another book project in there to go that far. But I think just to bring it back a bit to some of the early discussion as well, the questions around values and the question around, this has always been with us. Well, there has been a change politically and institutionally in many of the cases we look at in the book, and it has to do with a particular economic arrangement that often goes under the name neoliberalism, right? of profit seeking, of market logics extending into the public sector, growth for growth's sake, and so on. And what we find in many of these wars and fights we look at is that they are kind of profit maximizing ventures, where someone else is dealing with the negative externalities, the way a polluting industry has often been able to do, right? To export the costs to someone else. Even law enforcement, public authorities involved in fighting these wars have started to behave like these sort of profit maximizing actors. So this has been sort of part of a shift over time, and we've certainly seen since the 1980s, 1990s, how many of these wars and fights against crime, migration, terror, and so forth have grown and proliferated. So they are in a way part and parcel of that very story of growth. They are kind of the most extreme example in some ways of that particular mindset, one could say. But that's partly something, a stone we partly leave unturned in the book.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point. If you, Dave, got any final thoughts, but I think the fact that actually economics and the way we think about economics is actually fueling wars, which often is not the focus, I think, for a lot of economics. But
yeah, and I think, I mean, you can make a case that economic growth is preventive in relation to violence. I certainly think when you get a drastic economic decline, you know, that has fed into a lot of wars.
Yeah.
On the other hand, and I think, you know, many of these enterprises we're talking about are part of a certain kind of economic growth. There are a lot of civil wars that have been fueled by processes of growth, processes of appropriation of land, capitalist production, getting access to the oil in Sudan. I mean, this is a process of growth with massive casualties.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the things that we want to highlight is that, you know, when you have this sort of overarching macro project, and it might be these different wars that we're talking about, or it might be a project of growth, you know, we really do have to ask about the distribution of costs and benefits within that overarching project. And I think with growth, you know, Liz Truss, as you say, she says growth, growth, and growth are the priorities. She still seems to be remarkably popular in some quarters. You know, behind that is a rather obvious agenda of cutting taxes, cutting state spending, cutting welfare. And there are clear beneficiaries and losers from those processes. And that's part of the politics of advocating growth, that you favour that particular distribution of costs and benefits.
Yeah.
Of course, you could push for growth on a different political basis. But in practice, you know, the distribution of costs and benefits is something that we think is often neglected, and you know, we need more of that, really.
Absolutely. Well, I encourage everyone to look at that. The next time they're told by a politician that we need another war, you know, to be deeply suspicious. Thank you very much, Ruben. Thank you very much, David. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.